No. Oh, no. What do you mean? Good morning. We are moving right along in our quick survey of the Bible. Right now we're in the Old Testament. We'll be here through the end of next month, and then we're going to segue into the New Testament. And the material we're getting into right now is the period of the United Kingdom. When you say United Kingdom, what does that imply? That there's also a period of the divided kingdom. We know that. How many tribes are there in the nation of Israel? 12. And at this time, they are all united, but they're still not united. They haven't really gelled together as a nation. When Joshua led them into the land, they subdued the land. They're living in it. You see the dark period of Judges, where you've got these military leaders that rise up and help God's people in the face of persecution. Not really persecution, but they're being defeated by these various nations round about them, enslaved. Well, God delivers them through a series of judges. And morally, these men go downhill. The last major judge is Samson. Tell me about Samson real quick. Was he an outstanding, morally great guy? No. Could have been president of the United States, I suppose. They just went downhill. And then in the epilogue, chapter 17 through 21 of Judges, it's just horrible. It's just sordid. Well, that carries over into the next books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. You do have the little book of Ruth, and we looked at it extremely briefly, where it says at the very beginning, in the days of the judges, and you've got that bright spot in the midst of a dark period of Israelite history. Well, who are the last two judges? They're not talked about in the book of Judges, but they are in the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel. The last two judges, the first one is Eli, the next to last one, and then who would be the last judge? Samuel. And Samuel is going to anoint the first two kings, King Saul and then King David, eventually King David. How long did the United Kingdom last? We know how long because we can figure out there were 3 kings and they each reigned 40 years each. Isn't that nice and convenient? So what were you going to say? 120. 40 plus 40 plus 40. That period of time is 120 years. It's hard to remember a lot of specific dates, but I think what's very helpful is to round off David at 1000 BC. 1000 BC. Round off Abraham to around 2000 BC, and everything between them is between 1000 and 2000 BC. That's pretty vague, but that kind of helps us with a basic framework. David's reign actually would have been from 1010 to 970 BC. And that's going to help us determine when Saul reigned. So if David was started in 1010, when was Saul's reign? If David was 1010, then Solomon's reign would have been from 1050 to 1010. David from 1010 to 970. And then Solomon's reign would have been from 970 BC until around 931. And what happens in 931 BC? What happens at the end of Solomon's reign? The kingdoms divide, and that begins the period of the divided kingdom. So the United Kingdom from 1050 to 931 BC. And we're going to lickety split through 120 years right now. 120 years in 40 minutes. So not very long at all. If I wanted to read about the birth of Samuel, where would I go? In the book of 1 Samuel, where would I go? Where in 1 Samuel? All right, the first couple of chapters tell us about his birth. Take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 3. 1 Samuel 3, and I'm sorry, but we're skipping over the details concerning his birth, but you remember Hannah praying for a son, and she has not only Samuel, but she'll have other children. What was her promise to God? That if you give me children, if you give me a son, I will do what? Dedicate him to you. And so where does Samuel end up living? Okay, in the temple. Of course, at this time, it's just a tent. The temple won't be built officially until Solomon. But this is the tabernacle. Where is it? Is it in Jerusalem? No, Jerusalem's not even been conquered yet, actually. David will have to do that later. It's in Shiloh, which is in Ephraim, which was the tribe of Joshua. Joshua had the tabernacle at Shiloh, and it's there for hundreds of years. But anyway, you've got Samuel as a young man, and look what it says here in chapter 3, verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli. Listen to this. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. When you look at the period of Judges, where there are a lot of righteous people running around in Israel, we already said that. No. You go into the period of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Where were the priests in Judges? Where were they? Well, they were there, but they're not outstanding individuals themselves. Tell me about Eli. He is the high priest. Isn't he supposed to be just an outstanding individual? Supposed to be. But obviously he's not. Tell me about his sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Oh, no, that's a different story. That's Leviticus 10. That's Nadab and Abihu. They're defiling God's sacrifices. They're committing adultery. They're vile folks. And what does Eli do? When he's confronted about it by a prophet, what does Eli do? He goes to his sons and he says, you cut that out, guys. And his sons go, they just laugh in his face. How is God going to respond to the house of Eli? Because Eli is not able to control his sons who are serving as his priests. He's going to judge them. The word of the Lord was rare in those days when Samuel was a young man living at Shiloh, serving the Lord under Eli. He's not the high priest, but he's serving there in the tabernacle. And the Lord appears to Samuel. And you remember that story where Samuel's a young boy, he's sleeping, and he hears a voice that says, Samuel, Samuel. And what does Samuel say in response to the voice? I'm here. Here I am. And he runs to Eli, and Eli says, huh? What? Yeah, go back to bed. And so Samuel goes back to bed, and then the voice comes back. And they do this a couple of times. And then what does Eli realize? The Lord is calling you. Now, does the Lord talk to Eli? No. That's the implication here. The Lord does not talk to Eli. He's talking to a little child, a lad, but he's not talking to the high priest. What does that tell you? Israel's got problems. Now, look at the last verse of 1 Samuel 3. The Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So the conversation has been resumed now between God and his prophet Samuel. And I skipped verse 20. That's an important verse. All Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, from north to south is what that's saying. Everybody knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. This is the last judge, we would say. He is a prophet of the Lord. He's different than at least the most recent judges that have come before him, because he loves the Lord and he serves the Lord faithfully. Well, there's an incident with the Philistines, and we will continue to see the Philistines as a rival nation. What should have happened to the Philistines when Joshua led the conquest into the land? What should have happened to the Philistines? They should have been dispossessed. They should have been wiped out. Who were the mortal enemies of Israel in the days of Samson? The Philistines. And we see them here again in chapter 4. The Philistines. Goliath in 1 Samuel 17, when David fights against Goliath. Where was Goliath from? What was he now ethnically? A Philistine. He's from Gath. And you've got these nations that are continuing to be a thorn in the nation's side. As you look at 1st and 2nd Samuel and going into 1 Kings for Solomon's reign, you've got Eli discussed in the first couple of chapters, really through chapter 7, but the focus becomes Samuel in chapters 3 through 7. And I'm going to bring us, we're going to talk about Samuel very briefly, because I do want to mention Shiloh again. This is a really important verse. I mentioned it last week. Joshua 18, in the midst of the distribution of the land. You're reading all these names in Joshua 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and then all of a sudden you got this verse, Joshua 18, verse 1. Then the whole congregation of the people of Israel in the days of Joshua assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The land lay subdued before them. What is the tent of meeting? The tabernacle. This is a big deal. And as you start the story of Samuel, 1 Samuel 1 verse 3 says that Samuel's father, before Samuel was even born, his father would go up to Shiloh to worship, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. And that's how the story begins. Mrs. Elkanah, the mother of Samuel, she prayed to God. And it says in the midst of her prayer that only her lips moved, her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli took her to be drunk. Eli, the high priest, doesn't understand what Hannah's mother is doing, and he misunderstands. And that tells you a little bit about Eli. He just doesn't understand. He doesn't see well. In fact, that's emphasized in the story. His eyesight is very bad. Eli was very old, 1 Samuel 2, verse 22, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing. Oops, I didn't put that verse up there yet. There's an emphasis on hearing in these chapters. What was it? In 1 Samuel 3, Samuel, and says, "Here I am, I'm here." And there's this idea of hearing. Samuel's name does not mean God hears. It sounds similar to it. The actual name that would mean God hears is Ishmael, God hears. That name does mean that. But there's an emphasis on hearing in these opening chapters, and that is very interesting. Only Samuel is listening. God is listening, is talking to his prophet, and he continues this emphasis on hearing. He says basically, Eli doesn't hear. The high priest doesn't hear, but you hear me. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. And God tells him, what I'm about to tell you, anyone who hears it, their ears will tingle, he says. And you've got this emphasis on the word of the Lord that I mentioned just a moment ago. When you read these opening 3 chapters especially, you'll see an emphasis on hearing. In chapters 4 through 7, you'll see an emphasis on seeing. Eli doesn't see. He's blind. He's old, and he can't see well. And it's not just that he can't see physically. It's that he can't see spiritually. And that's also emphasized in those chapters. We're not studying 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're just breezing through it. And I just wanted to give you a couple tidbits to think about as you read that. Yes? Yeah. just like with Eli and others, yeah. Of course, you know the verse from James 4 that says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. What causes God to withdraw from us? Okay. We withdraw ourselves from him, but can God also respond to our sin and hide his face from us? I'll mention that in my sermon, as a matter of fact. You know the verse, Isaiah 59. His sin hides his face from us. So God can withdraw from us. But what does James say? You draw near to God, he will respond. He will draw near to you. What's the previous statement, though? In verse 7, James 4, verse 7. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, he will draw near to you. We all have ups and downs. There are always going to be times in our lives when we feel close to God. And then there are going to be times when we feel like, hey, where are you? Where is God? Even when we feel like we aren't close to him. Is he distracted? Is he not thinking about us? We've looked at this in many ways, many times. And we know God is always concerned for us and cares for us. One of those beautiful verses where Jesus says, sparrows, they're cheap. I mean, sparrows a dime a dozen. Yet when one of them falls to the earth, your heavenly Father knows. And he says, let me tell you, you are worth more than a bunch of sparrows. He's using a little sarcasm there, but what he's saying is, if God cares so much about sparrows, don't you think he really cares for you? He really cares for us. God expects a lot out of Eli. Why does God expect a lot out of Eli? Because he's his high priest. And he is not talking to him. God and Eli are not on speaking terms. It's a little boy, Samuel, who emerges during this dark period of time. Yes, sir. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it is possible that he was through a family relation related to the Levites. That is a possibility. It's in the chronology of First Chronicles, and I'm not remembering exactly the connection. But he's identified more as a prophet in Scripture than he is a priest. He does. What's emphasized is his service as prophet rather than priest. But that is a question we grapple with. How exactly is this? Is he adopted by Eli in that sense, and so he's able to do that? Well, in 1 Samuel 8, things change. There's a transition. And so chapters 1 through 7 go together. Beginning in chapter 8, you are going into the period of the United Kingdom. And you have Saul, who is going to be anointed king. How does that go? How does that story unfold? When Saul is appointed, you know this passage very well. There are warnings given. I mean, did God always know that Israel was going to have kings? Yeah, he prophesied about it. And Genesis 49, he talked about how from Judah would come kings. They would be descended from him. Verse 6, 1 Samuel 8, verse 6, the thing displeased Samuel when the people asked for a king. And he goes to God in prayer. Verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. How did Samuel feel when the people asked for a king? Were his feelings hurt? You bet. Now, was Samuel a king? No. They want a king. Why? Why does Israel want a king? To be like everyone else. You see that at the end of verse 5? Appoint for us a king, Samuel. Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. So God gives them a king. He gives them what they really wanted, someone who looked like a king. What was so special about Saul? What was his defining characteristic? He was tall. Yes, sir? Handsome. Okay. He looks like a king. What did you say? Tall. So this is a handsome man right there in verse 2. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So he was head and shoulders. And fearful. His entire life is characterized by fear. That is foreshadowed, I think, by Gideon, the judge, who was also dominated by fear. We didn't talk about that in our quick survey, but he is appointed king. What will happen eventually to the kingdom? Will Saul pass on his kingship to his son? Why not? Why doesn't Saul continue a dynasty? He's the only king from the tribe of Benjamin. And his sons do not continue the lineage through him. Why not? Because God rejected him. If we jump over to 1 Samuel 15, and by the way, it is during this time when the nation of Israel, when these 12 tribes really begin to unite as a nation, when they have a king. And so there's a lot of good that comes from a king. But it's unfortunate that that's what it took. Because who was their king? God. Who is our king? God. Jesus our Lord is our king. We need to remember that. We serve the Lord Jesus. We don't need human people to serve as our idols, as the people that we worship and adore. Because every single person has something about them in common, and that is that they're sinners. They're fallible. They make mistakes. What about God? Does he ever make mistakes? Jesus our Lord, he's sinlessly perfect. He will never disappoint us. Samuel appointed Saul as king and gave the people what they wanted. Somebody who looked like a king, but you can see here in 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." When Saul was trying to plead with Samuel in that situation, he grabbed onto Samuel's robe as Samuel was leaving. And what happened to the robe? It tore. And Samuel looks back and says, "Now I'm to buy a new robe. You owe me $100. What does he say to him? You hear that tearing? That tearing of the robe? That's what the Lord has done to you. He has torn the kingdom. And that becomes a theme. When Jeroboam is appointed king, remember the prophet Abijah went to him. And what did he do with the robe? Tore it in how many pieces? 12, and he gave 10 to Jeroboam and said, God has torn the kingdom from Solomon. He's given 10 tribes to you. That word tear, it's a common word, sure, but it keeps recurring. All right, we look at 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, and we go, the neighbor who is better than you. And we associate a name with that. Who is that? David. Where does it say in 1 Samuel 15 that David is the one who is the neighbor better than Saul? Doesn't. But what do you see in 1 Samuel 16? What happens in 1 Samuel 16? David is anointed king. Here's something really interesting that happens over the course of 1 and 2 Samuel. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We're going to talk about David for a moment. But this is what happens. He kills Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. And that puts David on the map. People know who David is. He is now a household name. This young man kills the Philistine giant Goliath that all the soldiers of Saul's army feared. And they start getting really excited about him. 1 Samuel 18, the women sing a song to one another. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Up to this point in time, how many people had David killed? One. What's going on here? The song about David, oh, we love David. The song about David is he's killed his 10,000s. Well, this is a comparative. They're exaggerating, obviously. They're saying, oh, Saul's great. We love Saul. He's the king after all. But, he's got David. David has slain his 10,000s. This little song, this little phrase will recur again 2 more times. So it'll appear a total of 3 times. 1 Samuel 18, when David is interacting with the Philistines. We won't have time to really get into all of that, but they're saying, hey, David wants to ally with us. Isn't he the guy that they all sang those songs about? Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And then later in 1 Samuel 29, you see it again, the same reference. This is important. This is a chant that the women are singing about David. And in 1 Samuel 18, when Saul is excited about the death of Goliath, yay, Goliath's dead. And David, he's my soldier now. He's in my army. Yeah. And then the women start praising David beyond Saul. How does that make Saul feel? Jealous. And then he puts it together, doesn't he? When Saul starts hearing the women chanting, David's killed his 10,000s, that's when he puts it all together. David is my neighbor who is better than me. David's the one. What else can he have but the throne? That's what Saul says. He's got the accolades of the people. What else is there except the throne? And Saul, being God's anointed king, humbly accepts the will of the Lord. No, he does not humbly accept the will of the Lord. What does Saul begin to do then? When he realizes that David is the one that God is going to select as his successor, he plots to try to kill him. And he begins to chase David all over the countryside, everywhere. All right, let's go back. Let's go back to 1 Samuel 16. Saul is rejected as king in 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 16 is when David is a nobody. He's a nobody. And he is anointed king. Let's read this just a little bit because this is important. Who is sent to the house of Jesse to anoint David as king? Samuel, the same guy who anointed Saul as king, is sent. And Samuel makes a big deal out of it. He tells everybody, I'm going to, oh, no, he doesn't. He doesn't say, I'm going to go tell everybody, I'm going to go anoint a new king. No, he does it secretly because he's afraid of Saul, retribution. And tell me about Jesse's sons. Tell me about them. Are they scrawny and weak and, they're just kind of nerdy? No, they're strong. They're powerful. And when Samuel sees the firstborn, he's presented to him. I mean, doesn't that make sense? The firstborn would be the king. And what does Samuel say to himself when he sees Eliab, when he sees this first son? Verse 6, when they came, he looked on Eliab and said, surely, or thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Young, strapping young man. And what does God say? No, we're going to do this my way. We're not going to pick somebody based on appearance only. We're going to pick somebody to be my king because of their heart. Their heart is right. I'm paraphrasing, but let's just look at what God actually says. Verses 6 and verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, i.e. Saul, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. We still got that emphasis on seeing going on here. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. What is the moniker that is given to David? He is a man after God's own heart. And it all starts right here. And I know you know this well, and we're just surveying and going through this quickly. Is David the second son? The third? Oh, he's the last. He's the youngest. He's kind of the runt of the litter. But he's the one who was appointed king. And in chapter 17, he is placed at the forefront of the people because he kills Goliath. That's in 1 Samuel 17. We're not going to look at that chapter. We know it very well anyway. But you do see the character of David in 1 Samuel 17 when he kills Goliath. Who does he credit with defeating Goliath? God, not his own prowess. What did Saul trust in? What was it that he tried to put on David? Armor. And David puts it on and he says, this isn't going to work. What does Goliath have? Armor. He's got an armor bearer. He's big, humongous guy. But who wins? David kills Goliath by ingenuity, by help from the Lord. And how does the nation of Israel respond to Goliath being killed? I mean, Goliath taunted Israel for 40 days. Send somebody out to fight me. You guys scared? Yeah, we're scared. Send somebody. Everybody knew about this. And then David kills him. And you all heard of the TV show Everybody Loves Raymond? Well, this is where it started. Everybody loves David. 1 Samuel 18. 1 Samuel 18, look at this. 1 Samuel 18, verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved David as his own soul. Who's Jonathan? He's Saul's son. Now, I don't know that Jonathan would have been next in line. He did have an older brother. I don't know that Jonathan would have been the next king. He might have been. But Jonathan, how does he respond to the Lord's newly anointed David? Does Jonathan say, oh, no, we're not giving up the throne. My family's not giving up the throne. No, he acquiesces to God's will. Jonathan's a great guy, isn't he? And they become best buds. 1 Samuel 18, verse 16, same verb. But all Israel and Judah loved David. He went out and came in before them. He's doing kingly stuff for them, even though he's not a king yet. Now Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Well, it pleased him at first until they hear, until he puts two and two together and realized David's really the guy who's going to take over the throne. And you have this emphasis on love. David and Jonathan make a pact because of the love that they have for each other, the love that he loved him as his own soul. And so everybody loves David. And how does that make Saul feel? Angry, jealous. We might not use the term, or they might not have used the term insane, but he goes crazy with jealousy. And eventually it cost him his life. If we were studying 1 Samuel, it really starts in 1 Samuel 28, but you have really before that, 1 Samuel 27. It's an exciting climax at the end of 1 Samuel, chapters 27 through 31, where you have Saul, who has been chasing David all around, as you well know, and then David goes and associates himself with the Philistines. And what do the Philistines think David is doing whenever he goes on his raids? It's trickery. David tells them, oh yeah, I went and killed a bunch of Israelites. Went and killed a bunch of my own people. What was he actually doing? He was killing Philistines and killing them all so no one could report and say, this is what David's doing. Or you go fight against other nations too. Well, some of the Philistines don't like that David keeps hanging around, and they send him away. There's a big battle on Mount Gilboa in 1 Samuel 31. And what happens to Saul in that final confrontation on Mount Gilboa? He is struck, he is hurt, and then apparently he falls on his own sword. And 2 Samuel 1 tells us that apparently he had some help with that as well. You don't read about suicide a whole lot in the Old Testament. People don't go around committing suicide. That's pretty unusual. But Saul did. And what if David wasn't a couple hundred miles away? What if he had been there on Mount Gilboa, pretending to be fighting with the Philistines? Do you think he would have come to Saul's defense? Yes. And that's the point. Because David was not there. He's in the south. And Saul is up north fighting against the Philistines without David. Saul dies. Did David kill Saul? Did he have opportunities to kill Saul? He did. We're skipping over the story. I'm sorry. Why didn't David kill Saul even though he had opportunity? Because David said, he is the Lord's anointed. Did he trust God by not killing Saul? Explain. How does David demonstrate his trust in the Lord by not killing Saul when he had two opportunities? He believed in the word of Samuel. You will be king. And he let it play out. And isn't he being politically shrewd? Because one day David is going to be the king. What is he going to want people to do when he's king? Have aspirations to kill him? Or respect him as the king? So as you go into 2 Samuel, the story of David continues, and he's just the greatest guy in the world. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is when God makes a covenant with David. 2 Samuel 7 is extremely important, where God says, David, I'm going to establish an eternal covenant with you. As long as your sons are faithful to me, you will always have someone sitting on your throne, on the throne of David. Now, does God break his promise? Because the throne of David does not continue physically forever. Eventually, the Babylonians are going to defeat the southern kingdom of Judah. Did God break his promise to David? No. Why not? Because, because one, his sons, his descendants, were disobedient to the Lord. There were a handful of kings in the southern kingdom who were good, and we'll talk about that a little bit next week as we have time. But what Jolynn is saying is because ultimately the promise made to David in 2 Samuel 7 is fulfilled in Jesus. And how long is Jesus going to reign as king? Forever. The promise God made to David in 2 Samuel 7 does come true. And he will always have someone ruling on his throne. Okay. Okay. And we'll talk about that a little bit next week as well. God always has a remnant. He always has a descendant of David. During the days of the return, there's a governor. His name's Zerubbabel. And he's the one who builds the temple, the second temple after Solomon. guess what? He just happened to be a direct descendant of David. Not that he had any kingly power, but you always have these people who are descended from David. Everything's great with David. I mean, he's a man after God's own heart. Everything goes perfectly in his life. No, 2 Samuel 11 begins the story about David and Bathsheba. David and Bathsheba. Samson had his Delilah. David has his Bathsheba. David acts a lot like Samson in this regard. And you have him lusting after a woman. I mean, doesn't David have a harem? He has several wives. But look at verse 1. 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, listen to this. The time when kings go out to battle, David was out fighting against his enemies. No, David's at his palace. He's at the wrong place at the wrong time. And as 2 Samuel 11 unfolds, where David sins with Bathsheba, they try to cover it up. Eventually, what does David have to do in order to cover up his adultery with Bathsheba? Murder her husband, Uriah, make it look like it wasn't murder, make it look like he was just fighting and other people got killed. And you look at the next to last verse. Oh, it is the last verse, excuse me. The very last verse of 2 Samuel 11. It should say verse 27 on the screen. 2 Samuel 11, verse 27. Here's the only divine commentary on the incident with David and Bathsheba. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. As we read through Genesis and we saw all the really rotten things that Abraham did and Jacob, where does it say, and the Lord was displeased with what Abraham had done? Or Jacob, he was displeased. It doesn't. You don't have that divine commentary very often. This is important. This is when David's throne begins to be in jeopardy. What happens in 2 Samuel 12? Who comes to David? Nathan the prophet. And Nathan tells him a story. And you know the story. He says, hey, David, does Nathan make it sound like it's a parable? It's a made-up story? He makes it sound like this is real. And he says to him, let's just read it, because I'm going to mess it up. 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 4. The Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds. But the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink of it from his cup. This is a pet. It was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who would come to him. He took the poor man's lamb, his pet, and prepared it for the man who would come to him. And how does David respond? Oh, that's terrible. That's just awful. And look what he says in verse 6. He says, the man deserves to die in verse 6. He shall restore the lamb fourfold. Well, then what does Nathan say? You are the man. Had David tried to cover this up, this sin with Bathsheba? As soon as Bathsheba had finished mourning for her husband, what did David do? He married her, took her into his harem, tried to cover up the adultery and pretend that this baby was his. I mean, what else could he do? But God knows. And he sends his prophet and confronts him. Now David knows, everybody knows. Everybody knows. And he sins. We're gonna have to pick up with Solomon next week because we are out of time. But I hope this quick survey helps us and reminds us there are some great stories here. And there are a lot of applications that we can and should make that we're just going through quickly. This is biblical history. This is Israelite history, but this is also our history. Not that we're descended physically from these folks, but this is our spiritual legacy. This is God's word. And I'm glad that we have this opportunity to go through the Old Testament very quickly, because it's going to remind us of so many great truths. And one is that God made a promise to David, and through David would come Jesus. But that doesn't mean David was perfect. He made a lot of mistakes. And we'll have to continue the story next week. Thank you for paying attention and being part of our study today.